Sterling came down the steps, each one slow and heavy, the way he entered rooms where people already knew something was about to happen. His black leather shoes struck the cold concrete, and the woman looked up. Her amber eyes met his gray ones, and in that single instant, Sterling saw something in her that he knew all too well from other people. Fear. But she didn't run. She rose slowly, folded the leather-bound notebook shut, and pressed it against her chest as if it were the most precious thing she still owned. "Who are you?" Sterling didn't ask. He stated it, in that low, flat voice the people who worked for him knew was more dangerous than any shout. "Why are you in contact with my son?" The woman swallowed hard. Her hands tightened around the notebook, but her back stayed straight and her eyes didn't drop to the ground. "I'm not in contact with him," she said, her voice trembling, but every word clear. "He comes on his own. Every afternoon. I told him not to bring food anymore. Told him he should go home, but he kept coming back. He sits down on these steps and waits until I read." She bent to pick up the paper bag Knox had brought and set it at Sterling's feet like evidence. "I didn't ask. Not once. You can check the library cameras if you want." Sterling looked at the paper bag by his shoes. Bread, an apple, a small bottle of water, a meal his son had cut from his own lunch. The boy had gone hungry to feed this woman, and the thought made the anger in Sterling's chest flare even harder. He turned to Knox, his voice still controlled but hard as steel. "Get in the car. Now." Knox didn't move. The boy sat on the steps with both hands gripping the edge of his coat, staring straight at his father with the eyes Sterling recognized as an exact copy of Joanna's. And then Knox spoke. 7 words. More than the total number of words he had said to Sterling over the last 6 months combined. "You can't make her leave, Dad." Sterling went still. Not because the words challenged his authority. He was used to defiance from people far more dangerous than a 7-year-old child. But because Knox's voice shook. Because Knox's eyes were red. Because this was the first time in 2 years the boy had wanted something badly enough to open his mouth and ask for it. "She reads to me, Dad," Knox added, quieter now, as if his courage were running out. "She reads me things nobody else reads." Before Sterling could react, a bright voice rang out from the direction of the parking lot. "Book lady!" Brinley, 4 years old, brown curls flying wildly, shoes with blinking lights in the soles crunching over the dry leaves. She had opened the car door by herself, run across the lot, and charged straight toward the steps before the driver could catch her. Brinley didn't look at her father. She ran straight to the woman, wrapped both arms around her leg, and tipped her face up with a radiant smile. "Book lady, I missed you. Are you reading the bear story today? You promised." The woman, despite the fear still plain on her face as she faced Sterling, lowered herself onto one knee. She laid a hand on Brinley's hair, gently, naturally, with the kind of instinct no one could fake. "I remember, Brinley. I remember the promise." Sterling stood there. The Mafia boss who controlled half of Chicago. The man whose single phone call could change an entire neighborhood. And he stood there, watching both of his children cling to a woman living in an old car in the library parking lot. A woman so thin the evening wind might have carried her away. And the children were looking at her with an expression they hadn't turned toward him in a very long time. Trust. Warmth. Belonging. Sterling felt something twist inside his chest. Something that hurt more than anger. Something deeper than caution. It was the realization that his 2 children were missing the one thing he possessed, everything else in the world but couldn't buy, couldn't command, couldn't control. And a stranger with nothing but an old notebook and a trembling reading voice was giving them that thing every afternoon, for free, on the freezing steps behind the library. Sterling didn't invite her home. He ordered her. "Get in the car," he said to Knox and Brinley, then turned to the woman still standing on the steps, the leather-bound notebook pressed tight against her chest. "You too." It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't kindness. Sterling needed to understand why his son, silent for 2 years, had opened his mouth for this woman, and he wasn't in the habit of looking for answers in places he didn't control. Phoebe sat in the back seat with Knox and Brinley, her back straight, both hands resting on her lap, her eyes fixed ahead like someone counting down the moments until she would be allowed to leave. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't protest. She simply followed in silence, and Sterling recognized it as the reflex of someone used to obeying people stronger than herself, the kind of reflex that felt both familiar and deeply unpleasant to him. The Lincoln Park mansion opened before Phoebe like another world. Black iron gates sliding open on their own, cameras at every corner, 2 guards nodding as the car passed through. She took it all in with wide amber eyes, but didn't say a word. Sterling noticed the way she looked, and he noticed too the way she gripped the notebook tighter as she stepped through the front door, as though it were the one thing keeping her from vanishing inside a house this large. The dining room held an oak table big enough for 12. Tonight there were only 4. Brinley pulled her chair close to Phoebe at once, so close their elbows brushed each time the little girl reached for food. "Book lady, sit next to me, okay? I want to tell you about the goldfish at school. His name is Sponge. Tommy named him, but I don't like that name. I wanted to call him Light, but my teacher said we had to vote." Phoebe listened, not with the polite nod of an adult thinking about something else, but truly listened, tilting her head, asking questions, looking at Brinley as though the story of a goldfish were the most important thing in the world. Sterling watched from the other end of the table. He watched the way Phoebe cut her food into small pieces, but ate very slowly, one tiny bite at a time, with even pauses between them, like someone trying to make the meal last because she didn't know when the next one would come. He watched the way her eyes kept sweeping the room, stopping at the doorway, stopping at the windows, stopping at the hallway leading to the main entrance, marking every exit with the instinct of someone used to running. And he watched Knox. The boy sat across from Phoebe, silent, but eating. He finished the rice on his plate for the first time in months, without anyone reminding him, without anyone forcing him. Every now and then Knox looked up at Phoebe, only for a second, as if to make sure she was still there, then lowered his head and kept eating. "What did you used to do?" Sterling asked, without circling around it. Phoebe set down her fork. "Elementary school teacher. Before living in your car?" She didn't flinch, but her shoulders stiffened. "Before I lost my job, the school made cuts. I was the last one hired, so I was the first one let go. After that, everything piled up." She didn't say more. Sterling didn't ask more. He knew what everything piled up meant, because he had seen the bruises on her wrist, had seen the way she marked the exits in his dining room, had seen the way she sat upright in her chair like someone ready to stand and run at any moment. "Why read at the library?" "Because I like children. And because the library lets me sit there all day without asking why." Dinner ended. Phoebe stood, folded her napkin neatly beside her plate, and pushed her chair back into place. "Thank you for the meal," she said, her voice polite and calm. "I should go." She hadn't even taken a step before Brinley burst into tears. Not the whining cry of a 4-year-old wanting a toy. A loud, broken cry, the kind that sounded as if someone had just torn something precious out of her hands. "Don't go. Book lady, don't go." Brinley jumped down from her chair, ran over, and wrapped herself around Phoebe's leg, burying her face against Phoebe's knee. Phoebe stood in the middle of the dining room, her hands hovering over Brinley's head, not daring to hold her back because her eyes were on Sterling, asking permission, full of fear, not knowing what she was allowed to do inside someone else's home. Knox didn't cry, but he set down his fork and looked at his father with eyes Sterling would remember for a very long time after that night. Eyes that didn't demand, didn't challenge, only waited, as though the whole world of that little boy were hanging on Sterling's next answer. The dining room fell silent except for Brinley's sobbing. Sterling looked at his daughter clinging to the leg of a stranger, looked at his son waiting, looked at Phoebe standing in his house with her hands suspended in the air and eyes that didn't dare hope. "There's a guest room," Sterling said softly, without looking at her. One night, Phoebe woke at 5 o'clock in the morning, when the house was still sunk in the kind of silence she recognized was not peace, but emptiness. She lay in the widest bed she had ever slept in, beneath clean blankets, on soft pillows, in a warm room, and the guilt came before the gratitude. She didn't belong here. She knew that, but instead of lying still and waiting for someone to come tell her, "You can leave now," Phoebe did the only thing she knew how to do to repay kindness. She went downstairs to the kitchen. The mansion's kitchen was as large as the entire apartment she had once rented, before losing everything. A marble island, a double-door refrigerator full of food that someone living in a car would have looked at the way a person looks into a dream. Phoebe opened the refrigerator and found eggs, flour, milk. Her hands knew this work, the motions of someone who had once stood at a stove every morning cooking for her younger brother before school, who had once made breakfast for 20 children on school field trips. She mixed the batter, poured each spoonful onto the pan, flipped the pancakes with the smooth turn of a practiced wrist. The smell of hot butter and pancakes spread through the kitchen, warm and sweet, the kind of smell this house had probably not known in a very long time. Knox appeared at the kitchen doorway at 6:30. He was wearing pajamas, his hair messy, standing at the threshold watching Phoebe stack pancakes onto a plate. She looked up and gave him a small smile, but said nothing, didn't ask, "Did you sleep well?" or "Are you hungry?" Because she had already learned that Knox didn't need someone asking questions. He needed someone who didn't demand that he answer. Phoebe simply set another plate on the table. Knox looked at the plate, looked at Phoebe. Then he walked over to the table on his own, pulled out a chair, and sat down. No one called him. No one forced him. He chose it himself. Brinley came down 10 minutes later, curls stuck to her cheeks, eyes still heavy with sleep, but her mouth already talking before her feet even reached the table. "Book lady! You really stayed! I thought you were gone. You made pancakes? I want lots and lots." "Knox, look, book lady made round pancakes." Phoebe set a plate in front of Brinley, cut the pancakes into small pieces, and drizzled honey over them. Brinley held the fork in her whole fist, eating and talking at the same time, honey sticking at the corner of her mouth. Phoebe reached for a napkin and wiped the little girl's mouth with a gesture so gentle and natural, it looked like something she had done 1,000 times before. And maybe she had, only for another child, in another life. Knox watched that. Then he did one small thing that Sterling, standing behind the glass door of his study, looking out toward the kitchen, would remember forever. Knox poured milk into Brinley's cup by himself. No one told him to. No one asked. The boy held the carton with both hands, tipped it carefully, and poured just enough into his sister's cup. Brinley didn't even notice because she was busy telling Phoebe about a book with a cat that could fly. But Sterling saw it. He stood behind the glass 10 steps from the kitchen, black coffee in his hand long gone cold, and watched his son take care of his sister for the first time since Joanna had gone. A small gesture, 1 carton of milk, but it said more than any report from the 4 psychologists Sterling had hired and fired over the past 2 years. After breakfast, Brinley grabbed Phoebe's hand and tugged her upstairs, demanding to show off the book collection in her room. "You have to see. I have so many. There's one with a dragon, one with a bunny, one Daddy bought but I haven't read it yet because nobody reads to me." That last sentence Brinley said in a bright, innocent voice, without the faintest idea how heavy it was. "Nobody reads to me." Sterling heard it from the hallway. He stopped. His hand tightened around the doorframe. Then he walked into his study, closed the door, and didn't say a word about Phoebe needing to leave. On the second day, Phoebe still made breakfast. On the third day, she rearranged the books in Brinley's room so the little girl could reach them herself. On the fourth day, Knox sat down at the breakfast table before Phoebe even had the chance to call him. On the fifth day, Brinley stopped calling her book lady and started calling her Miss Phoebe, as if that had always been her name in this house. By the end of the week, no one said anything. Sterling didn't say, "You can stay longer." Phoebe didn't ask, "Should I go now?" They moved around each other inside that mansion, too large for the life inside it, like 2 planets that had found an orbit, not colliding, not drifting apart, only keeping enough distance to let them both pretend this was temporary. But Knox had started leaving his sketchbook on the kitchen table every morning instead of hiding it in his room, and Brinley had started saying tomorrow whenever she told Phoebe a story, as if tomorrow were certain, as if Phoebe would still be here to hear it. One night had become 1 week, and no one in that house, not even Sterling Cross, wanted to admit that 1 week probably wouldn't be enough. The reading began on the 3rd night. Brinley was the one who asked for it, of course, because Brinley was always the one who asked for everything in this house, with the kind of power only a 4-year-old could possess, the power of someone who didn't know how to fear being refused. Miss Phoebe read me a bedtime story. She tugged Phoebe upstairs right after dinner, her socked feet sliding over the wooden floor, her curls still damp from her bath. Knox had already been lying in his own bed in the room next door, but when he heard Brinley pulling Phoebe into the bedroom, he quietly carried his pillow over and sat in the corner of his sister's bed without saying a word, as if this were the place he had always sat every night. Only before, there had never been anyone there to sit with. Phoebe read one of the fairy tale books from Brinley's shelf, the one about the bear lost in the forest that Brinley loved. Her voice was soft and even, changing in tone for each character, and Brinley listened in complete fascination, her eyes wide, sometimes asking, "And then what happened?" before Phoebe had even turned the page. Knox didn't ask anything, but his eyes stayed wide open in the dark, listening to every word as though he were drinking water after a long thirst. On the fourth night, the fifth night, the sixth night, Phoebe moved from one book to the next on the shelf. Her voice became the last thing the children heard before sleep, and Phoebe didn't realize she was filling an emptiness this house had spent 2 years trying to ignore. Then came the ninth night. Brinley lay in bed hugging her stuffed rabbit tightly, watching Phoebe open the next book from the shelf. "I don't want this story," Brinley said. "I want a real story." Phoebe paused. "What do you mean by a real story, Brinley?" "A story from you, not a story from a book. A real story that you know. A story about real people." Phoebe looked down at the book in her hands, then over at Knox. He sat in the corner of the bed, hugging his pillow, silent, but his eyes were fixed on her, waiting. Exactly the same look he had given her on the library steps. The look that said, "Miss Phoebe, I'll listen to anything you read, as long as you read." Phoebe set the fairy tale book aside. Slowly, she opened the drawer of the nightstand, where she kept the leather-bound notebook each night, the notebook she had carried with her from the old car, the notebook she kept closer to herself than almost anything else left in the world. The leather cover was worn at the corners, soft and darkened from too many hands, too many nights pressed against her chest. Inside was Phoebe's handwriting, small, dense, filling every page, short poems she had written at midnight, notes about the sound of someone's laugh, scraps of dialogue she had written down because she had been afraid of forgetting, afraid that if she didn't write them down, that voice would disappear completely. She opened to a page in the middle, drew in a breath, then she began to read, her voice softer than usual, trembling a little on the first words. "Today Wyatt told me the clouds look like cauliflower. I asked if he meant white cauliflower or green cauliflower. Wyatt said white cauliflower, because green cauliflower looks like trees, and nobody says clouds look like trees, sis." Then he laughed. He always laughed after saying something he thought was clever. Phoebe stopped, swallowed hard. Brinley lay still, hugging her stuffed rabbit tightly, her eyes never leaving Phoebe's face. "Who's Wyatt?" she asked. "My little brother," Phoebe said. "He liked writing. He liked watching clouds. He liked to laugh." "Where is he now?" Brinley's question came naturally and gently, the way 4-year-olds ask everything, without circling around it, without warning, without knowing that some questions can tear another person open. The room went quiet. Phoebe looked down at the notebook, at her own handwriting about the 16-year-old brother who never made it to 17, and she felt that familiar thing rising inside her chest, the thing it had taken her 4 years to learn not to let devour her. "He isn't here anymore," Phoebe said, in a voice so calm that only someone fighting not to break could ever sound that calm. Brinley nodded slowly, with an understanding no 4-year-old should ever have to carry. "Like my mommy," Brinley said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And in the bedroom where the star-shaped night light cast little glows across the ceiling, 2 children who had lost their mother and 1 woman who had lost her brother sat in silence together, sharing something none of them was old enough or strong enough to name, but all of them recognized. Out in the hallway, Sterling stood with his back against the wall beside the children's door. He had been standing there ever since Phoebe began reading. He had heard all of it. Wyatt's name, the tremor in Phoebe's voice, Brinley's question. The 3-word answer, "Like my mommy." From a 4-year-old daughter, he had convinced himself remembered nothing about Joanna. Sterling's hand gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his jaw clenched, not from anger, not because Phoebe had said anything wrong, but because he had just heard his daughter speak about death in the same tone a child might use to talk about the weather, and he realized this was what he had created with 2 years of silence, with 2 years of never speaking Joanna's name inside the house, with 2 years of believing that if he didn't speak of loss, loss itself would disappear. It hadn't disappeared. It had only taught his daughter that losing someone you love was normal. Sterling didn't walk into the room. He stood in the hallway until Phoebe's voice began reading again in a soft murmur beyond the door, until Brinley's steady breathing told him the little girl had fallen asleep, until the house sank once more into silence. Then he left, walking very quietly, back to his study, closing the door behind him, and sitting alone in the dark for a very long time. Phoebe found the sketchbook on a Saturday morning when Knox had gone out to the backyard with Marsh. She was tidying the boys' room, changing the sheets, picking up clothes from the floor, and the notebook was under the pillow, hidden there carefully like a secret Knox didn't want anyone to touch. Phoebe hadn't meant to open it, but the sketchbook slipped when she lifted the pillow, falling open to the middle, and her eyes landed on the drawing before she could look away. A woman, pencil, fine lines, drawn with care, shoulder-length hair, slightly curled at the ends, narrow shoulders, her body angled a little to the left, as if she were turning back to look at someone. One hand raised in a wave, but no face. The space from forehead to chin was completely blank, not a single pencil mark, as if Knox had drawn up to that point, then stopped, set the pencil down, and couldn't go any further. Phoebe turned the page. The next drawing. The same woman, the same hair, the same shoulders, this time sitting in a chair with both hands resting in her lap. No face. She turned another page. The woman standing in a doorway, light behind her outlining her body. No face. Another page. She was holding a small child. The child had a face, round, smiling. The woman holding the child didn't. Phoebe turned through more than 30 pages. Every page held a drawing. Every drawing showed the same woman, and not one of them had a face. She sat down on the edge of Knox's bed with the sketchbook in her lap, and she understood. She understood because she knew that feeling. Knew what it was to lie in the dark trying to picture the face of the person you loved most, and seeing only blurred fragments. Knew what it was to panic, because memory was fading a little more each day, and there was no way to hold it in place. Knox was forgetting his mother's face. The 7-year-old boy kept drawing the mother he had lost, trying to keep her on the page, but her face was slipping from his memory faster than his fingers could draw it. Phoebe closed the sketchbook and slipped it back under the pillow exactly where it had been. She didn't tell Knox she had seen it. She didn't ask. She didn't make it into something large, because she knew that when someone points straight at the pain you are trying to hide, it doesn't help you heal. It only makes you build your walls higher. Instead, the next afternoon, Phoebe spread drawing paper across the kitchen table when Knox came down for a snack. "Knox, I want to ask you a favor," she said, lightly and naturally, as if the idea had just occurred to her. "I want to learn how to draw, but I'm terrible at it. Could you teach me?" Knox looked at the paper, looked at the pencil, looked at Phoebe. Then he sat down slowly and picked up the pencil. They started with Brinley. Phoebe said they should draw Brinley first because she was the easiest. Curls, round cheeks, always smiling. Knox drew, and Phoebe sat beside him, not teaching the way a teacher would, but guiding him with questions. "Are Brinley's eyes round or long? Doesn't she have that tiny little crease on the right side of her nose? I think I can see it. When Brinley smiles, where do her cheeks scrunch up?" Knox began to look, really look, not with a passing glance, but by noticing each small detail, in the way Phoebe was teaching him without ever naming the lesson. They drew Brinley, then they drew Marsh, and Knox actually almost smiled when he sketched Marsh's thick eyebrows because they look like caterpillars. Then Phoebe asked, gently, without pressure, "Is there anyone else you want to draw?" Knox went silent. The pencil stopped on the page. The boy stared down at the blank sheet for a long time, and Phoebe saw his fingers tighten around the pencil until the tips turned white, gripping it as if he were holding on to something about to slip away, something he knew that if he let go, he would never be able to hold again. He didn't draw. Not yet. But he asked, in a voice so soft Phoebe had to lean closer to hear, "Do you forget Wyatt's face?" Phoebe stopped. The pencil in her own hand stopped in the air, too. She looked at Knox, into the eyes of a 7-year-old carrying a fear far too large for his age, the fear that one day you could love someone and no longer remember their face. "Sometimes," Phoebe said, truthfully, without hiding it, without softening it, because Knox didn't need an adult to lie and tell him everything would be fine. He needed someone to tell the truth, that things could be very hard, and you could still keep living. "Sometimes I forget the shape of his face. But I remember his voice. I remember the way he laughed. I remember that he always said the word seriously whenever he wanted me to believe something." Phoebe set her pencil down and looked straight into Knox's eyes. "A memory doesn't have to be perfect, Knox. It just has to be real." Knox looked at her, then looked down at the blank page. He didn't draw that day, but he didn't close the sketchbook either. He left it open on the kitchen table, the blank page facing upward, like a promise to himself that he would try. Not today, but he would try. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of autumn afternoon in Chicago, when sunlight slants through the maple trees in the garden behind the mansion and turns everything the color of honey. Phoebe was sitting on the wooden steps leading down to the lawn, watching Brinley chase a yellow butterfly drifting across the garden. The little girl ran with both hands lifted toward the sky, fingers spread wide as if she could catch the butterfly's wings, calling out, "Wait, wait," as though the butterfly understood human language and would stop if only she shouted loudly enough. Knox sat beside Phoebe with his sketchbook open on his lap, drawing Brinley as she ran. The boy didn't speak, but his pencil moved steadily across the page, and every so often he looked up at his sister, then lowered his eyes and kept drawing, capturing the moment in lines instead of words, in his own way. The butterfly flew over the fence and disappeared. Brinley stood in the middle of the grass with both arms hanging at her sides, staring after it with the solemn expression of someone who had just lost something important. Then she turned, ran back to Phoebe, and climbed up to sit beside her on the step. Her short legs swung back and forth, her shoes with blinking lights tapping together each time they swung. "Miss Phoebe," Brinley said, in the voice she used when she was about to ask something far bigger than 4 years old should ever have to ask. Serious and slow, as though she were weighing every word, even though Brinley had never weighed a single thing in her life. "You lost your little brother." Phoebe looked at Brinley. She didn't know where this had come from, didn't know how long the little girl had been thinking about it, or whether it had simply risen up the way children say everything, suddenly and without warning. "Yes," Phoebe said softly. Brinley nodded, as if confirming an equation in her head. "Daddy lost Mommy." A pause. "Knox lost Mommy." Another pause. Then the little girl looked down at her shoes, her voice a little smaller. "I lost Mommy too, but I don't remember." The last sentence wasn't sad in the way adults are sad. It was sad in the way children are sad. Sad because something is missing that she knows she should have, but doesn't know what it is. Like being hungry for a food she has never tasted, but somehow knows exists. Phoebe didn't say anything. She waited, because she knew Brinley wasn't finished. "But now you have us," Brinley said, and this time she looked up at Phoebe with wide, round brown eyes, clear and bright, without the smallest trace of doubt. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a declaration, certain in the way children are certain about everything, completely and absolutely, without needing anyone to confirm it. Phoebe felt her chest tighten. She smiled at Brinley and kept her face calm because the little girl was watching, and she didn't want her own tears to become the worry of a 4-year-old child. But her hands trembled as she wrapped an arm around Brinley's shoulders and drew her close, and Brinley rested her head against Phoebe's chest, as naturally as though this were where she had lain every day of her life. Knox didn't look up from his sketchbook, but he shifted a little closer until his shoulder touched Phoebe's, lightly, only enough to let her know he was there. The three of them sat on the wooden steps in the backyard. The afternoon sun poured over their hair, and if anyone had looked from a distance, they would have seen a picture so ordinary it might have seemed dull. A woman holding one child while another child sat beside her drawing. But nothing about this was ordinary. In the study on the second floor, Sterling was sitting while Marsh gave a report about the shipment at the South Harbor. Marsh was talking about figures, schedules, the contact at the dock, but Sterling wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed through the tall glass doors on the backyard, on Brinley lying in Phoebe's arms, on Knox sitting close beside her, and something inside his chest twisted. Not pain, something heavier than pain. The realization that his children were being held by someone else, and were completely at peace with it. Marsh stopped speaking. He followed Sterling's gaze, looked out at the garden, looked at the scene on the wooden steps. Silence stretched for several seconds. "She's not taking your children from you, Sterling," Marsh said, his voice low and blunt, with the kind of directness only a man who had stood beside Sterling for 10 years would dare use. "She's giving them back to you." Sterling didn't answer. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't turn to look at Marsh. He only sat there, his eyes never leaving the window, watching Phoebe hold his daughter in the autumn sunlight, and he thought about Joanna, thought about the last time he had seen someone hold Brinley like that, the last time Knox had sat beside someone without his guard up, the last time this house had held a woman sitting in the backyard while the children moved around her with that instinctive sense of belonging. 2 years ago, with Joanna. And now, with a woman who had lived in an old car in the library parking lot, a woman who owned nothing but a leather-bound notebook and trembling hands. Sterling still didn't take his eyes from the window, and Marsh was wise enough not to say another word. Knox didn't tell anyone he was drawing. Not Phoebe, not Brinley, and certainly not Sterling. 3 weeks had passed since Phoebe stepped into this house. 3 weeks since that afternoon when they had sat drawing together at the kitchen table, and Knox drew every night in his room, after Phoebe finished reading and turned out the light, after Brinley fell asleep, after the house sank into the kind of silence the boy both hated and knew too well. He drew beneath the glow of his nightlight, the sketchbook propped on his lap, the pencil brushing across the page with a soft scratching sound in the dark. He drew his mother, but this time he didn't begin with her hair and shoulders the way he always had before. He began with her eyes, his mother's eyes. He remembered her eyes because Brinley had the same ones. Brown, warm, slightly tilted at the corners when she smiled, and Phoebe had taught him how to look at the smallest details in order to remember the whole. From the eyes, he drew downward to the nose. His mother's nose was straight and delicate, with the faintest lift at the tip. He remembered because every time she kissed his forehead, the tip of her nose felt cool, and he would scrunch up his face and laugh. From the nose, he drew downward to the mouth. His mother used to smile more on one side, the left lifting before the right, as if her smile always began with one half before spreading across the whole of her face. He remembered that. He remembered. The drawing took 5 nights. 5 nights of Knox, sitting beneath the glow of the nightlight, drawing and erasing and drawing again, gripping the pencil so tightly his fingers turned sore, staring at the blankness on the page, and trying to wring every drop from a 7-year-old memory so he could find again the face of the woman he loved most in the world. The woman he had been losing a little more each day. On the 5th night, he set the pencil down and looked at the drawing. It wasn't perfect. The line of the jaw trembled, the eyes were a little uneven, the hair on one side thicker than the other, but there was a face. For the first time in more than 30 drawings, the woman in Knox's sketchbook had a face. A half smile, eyes looking forward, hair falling to her shoulders. Mom. Knox stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he picked up the pencil and wrote beneath it in crooked block letters. The handwriting of a 7-year-old child, writing the most important thing he had ever written. For Miss Phoebe, who helped me remember. He tore the drawing carefully from the sketchbook, folded it in half, and hid it inside the pocket of his jacket. And he waited. He waited until dinner. Dinner was the one time all 4 of them sat together at the same table, the one stretch of the day when Sterling wasn't inside his study, and Brinley wasn't running wild through the house, the closest this house ever came to feeling like a family. That night, Phoebe made pasta, the meal Brinley liked and Knox didn't mind, and Sterling ate without comment because he never commented on food. The meal was almost over. Brinley was talking about the goldfish at school, Sponge, the fish she still wanted to rename Light. Phoebe listened, nodded, asked questions. Knox sat in silence, his right hand resting on the pocket of his jacket, his fingers touching the folded edge of the paper inside. Then, in the brief moment when Brinley paused to take a breath, Knox pulled out the drawing. He didn't say anything. He only laid the folded paper on the table, pushed it gently toward Phoebe, then drew his hand back as quickly as if he had touched something hot. Phoebe looked at the paper, looked at Knox. The boy didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on his plate of pasta, but his shoulders were rigid, and his fingers were gripping the edge of the table. Phoebe opened the paper. Slowly, carefully, and Joanna's face looked up at her from the trembling pencil lines of her 7-year-old son. The eyes were a little uneven, the hair on one side thicker than the other, but the smile was right, the half-smile, beginning on the left before spreading to the right, the smile Knox had managed to save through 5 nights of drawing beneath the nightlight. Phoebe looked at the drawing. Her hand tightened around the edge of the paper. She drew in a very deep breath and held it there, because she knew that if she let it go, she would cry, and she didn't want Knox to think his drawing made her sad, when the truth was that it was so beautiful she could hardly bear it. "It's beautiful, Knox," she said, her voice low and quiet but steady. "Your mother is so beautiful." Knox still didn't look up, but his shoulders eased, slowly, as if something heavy had just been lifted from his back. Brinley leaned across the table and looked at the drawing. "Does it look like Mommy, Knox?" she asked. Knox nodded. One small nod, but certain. It looked like her, he remembered. He had drawn her. Mom had a face again. Sterling looked at the drawing from the far end of the table. He looked at his wife's face on that sheet of paper, the smile he still saw every night when he closed his eyes but never spoke aloud, and something inside him cracked. Not shattered, cracked, like a thin sheet of ice on a lake when spring first begins to touch it. He stood up, pushed back his chair, walked away from the table without saying a word. Brinley called, "Daddy, where are you going?" But Sterling had already crossed the hallway, entered his study, and closed the door. He stood in the middle of the room in darkness, because he didn't turn on the light, his back against the door. And for the first time in 2 years he felt tears. They came without warning, without permission, rising from someplace deep in his chest that he had locked shut on the day Joanna died. Sterling Cross, the man no one in the Chicago underworld dared look straight in the eye, stood alone in his dark study and didn't know what to do with the 2 tears running down his face. That night, Sterling couldn't sleep. He lay in his room beneath the towering ceiling in the dark, and Joanna's face kept rising before him from the trembling pencil lines of Knox's drawing. The half-smile, the eyes looking straight ahead. For 2 years, he hadn't allowed himself to remember that face, and tonight his son had placed it on the dinner table between plates of pasta and the sound of Brinley talking, as if Joanna had never truly gone, as if she had only missed 1 meal and then returned. Sterling got up at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning and went downstairs to the kitchen for water. At that hour, the mansion was dark and cold, with only the automatic hallway lights flickering on as he passed. He pushed open the kitchen door and stopped. Phoebe was sitting at the island. Her leather-bound notebook lay open in front of her, but she wasn't reading. She sat perfectly still, both hands resting on either side of the notebook, her eyes lowered to the page without seeing anything on it, and her shoulders were shaking softly, steadily, with the breath of someone crying without making a sound. She didn't know Sterling was there. She didn't hear him because she was too deep inside her own pain. Tears were falling onto the pages of the notebook, soaking into the handwriting, blurring the ink in the corner of the page. Sterling looked at her. His first instinct was to turn away. He didn't know how to handle tears. He didn't know how to handle his own tears from earlier in the study, and he knew even less about what to do with someone else's. Joanna had once told him he was like a wall, hard and cold and very good at standing there, but never knowing how to hold anyone. He turned as if to leave, but his feet didn't move, because he saw the way Phoebe's hand was gripping the edge of the notebook, gripping it exactly the way Knox gripped his pencil when he drew his mother, the grip of someone afraid that if they let go, they would lose the last thing they still had left to hold. Sterling stepped into the kitchen. He didn't turn on the light. He took a glass of water. Then instead of going back upstairs, he pulled out a chair and sat down on the other side of the island, across from Phoebe. She looked up. Her amber eyes were red, wet, slightly swollen. She startled when she saw him, quickly wiped her face, and closed the notebook, hiding her pain with the same reflex she used to mark exits whenever she entered a new room. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone. I'll go back upstairs." She started to stand. Sterling spoke, his voice low. "Sit." It wasn't an order. It wasn't an invitation. It was only one word, spoken in the voice of a man who didn't know how else to say what he meant, but didn't want her to leave. Phoebe looked at him. Then she sat down again. Silence. Sterling didn't ask if she was all right, because she clearly wasn't. He didn't ask why she was crying because he had no right to demand answers from someone else's pain. He only sat there, both hands wrapped around the glass of water, looking at the cold marble countertop, and waited. Not waiting for her to speak, only waiting, because sometimes sitting beside someone is enough. And maybe because the darkness in the kitchen felt safe. Maybe because after tonight she had seen Sterling flee the dinner table when he saw Joanna's drawing, and she knew he was carrying something just as heavy, or maybe simply because 2 o'clock in the morning is the hour when people no longer have the strength to keep their walls standing. Phoebe opened the notebook again. "My little brother," she said, her voice quiet now but no longer shaking, as if the tears had just washed away some of the thorns. "His name was Wyatt, 16 years old." She paused, breathed. 4 years ago. I was supposed to stay home and watch him that day, but I went to a job interview instead, a teaching position at an elementary school. I had wanted that job for a very long time. Her fingers turned a page of the notebook, brushing over her own handwriting. "Wyatt told me to go," he said. "Go ahead. I'm old enough." He went to the lake with his friends. A pause. He wasn't a strong swimmer. I knew that, but I went anyway. Silence filled the kitchen. Sterling could hear the refrigerator humming, the wind against the windows, the heavier rhythm of Phoebe's breathing. "He didn't come home," Phoebe said. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. Those 4 words held 4 years of guilt. 4 years of asking herself whether Wyatt would still be alive if she had stayed home that day. 4 years of knowing the answer might be yes, and there was no way in the world to go back and change it. Sterling was silent for a long time. The glass in his hands had warmed from the heat of his body, but he still didn't drink. He looked at Phoebe sitting across from him at the island, thin, exhausted, her eyes swollen, and he realized she had just given him something she hadn't given anyone in 4 years, the truth. And something inside Sterling, something he had locked tighter than any safe in his empire, opened. "My wife died because of me," he said, his voice so low it was almost impossible to hear. "They were aiming for me, but she was the one who paid for it." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Phoebe understood, because she carried the same kind of guilt. The kind reason tells you isn't yours. But the heart refuses to believe reason. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say, "It wasn't your fault," because she knew those words were useless. She had heard them 100 times, and they had changed nothing. Instead, she simply sat there, stayed. In the dark kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 adults carrying pain they both believed they had caused sat across from each other over the cold stone counter. Not touching, not comforting, not saying another word. But for the first time in a very long while, for both of them, silence wasn't loneliness. It was company. Brinley started running a fever at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, sudden in the way children get sick, without warning, without signs, spending the morning racing through the house talking about her goldfish sponge. Then by afternoon curling up on the sofa, flushed, glassy-eyed, her forehead so hot that Phoebe laid a hand on it and jerked back in alarm. Sterling wasn't home. Sterling was in a meeting on the south side of the city, the kind of meeting he never described to anyone, with his phone set to silent, because in his world, one phone vibration at the wrong moment could change the balance of an entire room. Phoebe called him 3 times. All 3 went to voicemail. She called Marsh. He didn't answer either. Then she stopped calling, because Brinley was crying, and the 4-year-old child burning with fever in front of her mattered more than anyone who wasn't picking up. Phoebe carried Brinley upstairs, laid her on the bed, and pulled a light blanket up to her chest. She found the thermometer in the bathroom medicine cabinet and checked her temperature. 103.1. Not dangerous yet, but enough to leave Brinley's face deeply flushed and her brown eyes, usually bright all the time, now hazy through tears as she looked at Phoebe. "I'm hot," Brinley whimpered. "I'm so hot, Miss Phoebe." "I know, sweetheart. I'm taking care of you." Phoebe ran downstairs to get a cloth, soaked it in cool water, wrung it out, then hurried back up. She laid the cloth across Brinley's forehead. The little girl frowned. Phoebe changed the cloth every 15 minutes, checked her temperature every 30 minutes, got Brinley to drink water in small sips because she refused to drink much at once, and told stories in a steady voice to keep her from becoming too restless. She did all of it through instinct that needed no thought, the instinct of someone who had once cared for a sick younger brother, who had once stayed awake all night watching Wyatt burn with fever when he was 12, because their mother had to work the night shift, and there had been no one else. Knox appeared at 7 o'clock that evening. He stood in Brinley's doorway, looking at his sister on the bed, her eyes red, her face burning. He didn't ask what she was sick with, didn't ask if Phoebe needed help. He simply sat down on the floor just outside the bedroom door, leaned his back against the wall, and pulled a folded piece of paper from the pocket of his jacket, the drawing of his mother, the portrait with the face he had finally finished the week before. He had asked Phoebe if he could keep another copy he had drawn for himself, smaller, rougher, but still with a face, still with the half-smile. Knox held the drawing in his hands, sat outside his sister's room, and didn't go anywhere. Brinley's fever climbed to 104 by 9 o'clock. Phoebe gave her fever medicine from the cabinet, the proper dose according to the weight listed on the bottle, then gathered Brinley into her arms, rocking her gently, humming some tune with no clear words, only a soft melody to make the child less afraid. Brinley cried in and out of sleep, and when the fever made her delirious, she called for her mother. "Mommy." Small, hoarse, tangled in tears. "Mommy, I'm hot." Phoebe held Brinley tighter. She didn't say, "I'm here." She didn't say, "Your mother isn't here." She simply held her, and hummed, and wiped the sweat from the little girl's forehead, and did everything a mother would have done, even though she wasn't her mother, even though she was only the woman living on borrowed grace in someone else's house, a woman these 2 children had chosen before she had time to choose them. Outside the bedroom door, Knox was still sitting there, the drawing of his mother in his lap, eyes open, not sleeping. Sterling came home at 2 o'clock in the morning. He stepped inside the house, sensed at once that the silence was wrong, saw 17 missed calls on his phone, 12 from Phoebe, 5 from Marsh. He went upstairs quickly and stopped at Brinley's bedroom door. The sight in front of him, Phoebe sitting in the chair beside the bed, head bent forward, eyes closed, asleep from exhaustion, but one hand still resting on Brinley's forehead, checking, or holding, or comforting. He couldn't tell which, because the line between care and love had long since blurred in her. Brinley was sleeping peacefully, breathing steadily, her fever broken, cheeks still pink but no longer burning red, the stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, and at the foot of the bed, Knox curled on the floor, his head resting on the sketchbook, the drawing of his mother beneath one small hand like a protective charm. The boy had sat guard over his sister all night and then fallen asleep there, refusing to go back to his room, refusing to leave. Sterling stood in the doorway, looking at Phoebe, looking at Brinley, looking at Knox. 3 people, each of them having lost the most important person in their life, asleep beside one another in the room where the star-shaped nightlight cast little patterns across the ceiling, and they looked like the things Sterling had not dared to name for 2 years. Family. He stood there for a long time, and inside his chest, something broke open. Not pain, not like the day he lost Joanna, when something shattered so violently he had thought he would never breathe again. This time it was different. Lighter, warmer, like the sheet of ice that had frozen solid inside his chest for 2 years was beginning to melt, slowly, drop by drop. Not loud, not dramatic, just melting because this room was too warm for ice to survive. The next morning Brinley's fever was gone. She lay in bed, her cheeks still faintly pink but her eyes clear again, asking for porridge and telling stories about Sponge the goldfish to her stuffed rabbit. Phoebe fed her one small spoonful at a time, wiped her mouth, tucked the blanket around her, and then when Brinley drifted back to sleep, she rose from the chair and felt her whole body ache from spending the night slumped over on the hard wooden seat beside the bed. Knox had gone back to his own room at dawn, when Marsh lifted him from the floor, still fast asleep, the sketchbook clutched tight in his hands. The house was quiet in the way a house is quiet after a storm. Everything still standing, but the air changed. Sterling was waiting for Phoebe on the back porch. He sat on the wooden steps leading down to the garden, both hands around a cup of black coffee, and when Phoebe stepped out through the glass door, he didn't turn around, but pushed the second cup of coffee he had already poured a little closer toward her. She sat beside him, one step away, close enough to talk, far enough that neither of them had to pretend this was normal. Silence for several minutes. Sterling looked out at the garden. Then he spoke, briefly, without looking at her. "Thank you. For last night." The words "thank you" left Sterling's mouth as if they had to pass through barbed wire just to get out. He wasn't used to speaking gratitude. In his world, people didn't say thank you. They repaid debts or acknowledged them through action. But last night hadn't been any kind of transaction. Phoebe hadn't taken care of his daughter for money, or for a place to stay. She had cared for Brinley because Brinley was crying and she was there. That was all. And that simplicity left Sterling with nowhere to place it in the structure of his world. "Brinley's all right now," Phoebe said. "She just needs one more day of rest, and she'll be running around again." He nodded. More silence. Autumn wind moved through the garden, carrying the scent of damp maple leaves and cold earth. Phoebe looked at Sterling from the corner of her eye, at the hard line of his jaw, the faint scar running along his neck, the gray eyes fixed on the garden without truly seeing anything in front of him because they were looking at something very far away, something very deep inside. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, gently, without pressing, only opening the door and letting him decide whether to walk through it. Sterling didn't answer at once. He set his coffee on the step, slipped a hand into the inner pocket of his coat, and pulled out a phone. Not the phone he used every day. This one was older, smaller. The screen cracked in one corner. The case faded with age. Phoebe looked at the phone and understood at once that it wasn't his. "Joanna's," Sterling said. "I've kept it for 2 years, in the drawer of my desk. I never opened it." He held the phone in both hands, gently, carefully, in a way he held nothing else in the world. "Why haven't you opened it?" Phoebe asked. "Because if I opened it, I'd hear her voice. And if I heard her voice, I'd have to remember she's gone." And if I remembered, I didn't know if I'd be able to stop. Phoebe didn't say anything. She understood. She understood because she had kept Wyatt's notebook for 4 years, and there were pages she couldn't bring herself to turn, lines she couldn't make herself read, because she was afraid the grief would swallow the last calm she still had. Sterling looked at the phone, then he powered it on. The screen lit up slowly, the battery nearly dead, and the old wallpaper appeared. Joanna and Knox at 5 years old, with 2-year-old Brinley asleep in her mother's arms. Joanna was smiling, the half-smile. Sterling drew in a breath. His finger opened the voicemail folder. One unheard message. Sent on the day Joanna died. He played it. Joanna's voice spilled into the air of the back porch. Soft, warm, a little tired, but gentle in the way only someone speaking to the person they love most can be. Sterling, I know you're busy. I know you probably won't hear this message until a very long time from now, because you always forget to check your voicemail. A small laugh. Tired but real. I want to tell you something. I know you're going to blame yourself. No matter what happens, you always blame yourself. Don't. The children need a father who knows how to love, not a father drowning in guilt. Joanna's voice paused for a beat, and when it came again, it was softer, almost a whisper. Let someone in, Sterling. I believe in you. The message ended. A soft beep, then silence. Sterling sat on the step with the old phone in his hand and didn't cry. He didn't cry because he had used up his tears the night before in the dark study. But he closed his eyes. Closed them for a long time, and Phoebe sat beside him, not touching him, not saying, "Are you all right?" Not saying, "She was right," not saying anything at all, because she knew there are moments when words only shatter what is just beginning to form. She sat there, beside him, on the cold wooden steps, in the middle of an autumn morning, with Joanna's voice still lingering in the air between them, and the silence between them, this time, wasn't the silence of two strangers sitting together in the dark. It was warmer than that, closer than that. It was something both Sterling and Phoebe recognized, but neither of them yet dared to name. They remained sitting on the back porch steps. Joanna's voice had faded long ago, but the air still held its echo, warm and heavy and fragile, like something that had just been opened, and both of them were afraid one strong breath might break it. Sterling still had his eyes closed, the old phone resting on his lap, and Phoebe sat beside him in silence, knowing that he had just given her something he hadn't given anyone in 2 years, and she knew she owed him the same. Not owed in the sense of obligation, but because he had been brave enough to open that phone in front of her, and courage deserved to be answered with courage. Phoebe set down her cup of coffee. Her hand touched the leather-bound notebook in her coat pocket. The notebook that was always with her, always within reach, like the last thread connecting her to Wyatt. She pulled it out, set it on her lap, and turned to the final page. This was the page she never read aloud to the children, never read aloud to anyone. This was the page she turned to every night, and then closed again. The page she read with her eyes in the dark and then cried over alone. The page she had kept for 4 years, like a wound she refused to let heal, because she was afraid that if it healed, she would forget. And forgetting Wyatt was something she couldn't bear. Handwriting. Crooked, slanted. The handwriting of a 16-year-old boy writing in a hurry. Maybe before he went out the door. Maybe at the kitchen table over breakfast, with the blue ink pen Wyatt always kept in his pocket. Phoebe, you worry too much. You don't have to take care of me forever. I'm grown up now. I love you. See you this afternoon. Phoebe read it aloud, her voice low and steady, not trembling this time because she had read those words in her mind thousands of times, and every syllable had carved itself into her bones. But speaking them out loud in front of someone else was the first time. Sterling opened his eyes, looked at the notebook, looked at the crooked handwriting on the yellowed page. See you this afternoon, Phoebe repeated, more softly. He wrote that line 1 week before he died. The afternoon he was talking about was the afternoon I wasn't home. The afternoon I went to a job interview, instead of staying home to watch him. She looked down at Wyatt's handwriting. Her finger touched the line, "I'm grown up now," lightly, as if afraid the ink would fade if she pressed too hard. 4 years, she said. For 4 years I've read that line and only seen the afternoon I was gone. Only seen my fault. Only seen "see you this afternoon" as a promise I betrayed. She paused, drew in a breath. But last night, after hearing Joanna's message, I read it again. And this time I saw something different. I saw, you don't have to take care of me forever. I saw, I'm grown up now. I saw a 16-year-old boy telling his sister that he was okay, that she didn't have to carry him on her shoulders, that she was allowed to live her own life. Phoebe looked at Sterling. Her amber eyes were dry, no tears, but bright in a way he had never seen before. My brother forgave me before I even had the chance to fail him. It took me 4 years to understand that. Sterling looked at her, then looked down at Joanna's phone resting on his lap. Let someone in. Joanna's words. You don't have to take care of me forever. Wyatt's words. 2 people who were gone, leaving behind 2 messages for the 2 people sitting on the back porch steps on an autumn morning in Chicago. 2 keys that Sterling and Phoebe had held in their hands for so long, but had never dared to turn. Neither of them said anything else. They sat there until Brinley's voice from inside the house broke the stillness. Miss Phoebe, I'm hungry. In a voice still a little hoarse after the fever, but already loud and demanding again, and Phoebe stood up, slipped the notebook back into her pocket, and went inside to care for the children as if it were the most natural thing in the world. 4 days later, Brinley drew a picture. Crayon on white paper, the lines of a 4-year-old, crooked and bright. 4 people standing together in front of a square house with a triangle roof. The tallest one wore black. That was Daddy. The little boy held a notebook. That was Knox. The curly-haired girl in the middle. That was Brinley. And the brown-haired woman standing on the right. That was Miss Phoebe. Brinley stuck the drawing onto the refrigerator with a star-shaped magnet, proud as if she were hanging a masterpiece in a museum. Knox looked at the drawing all afternoon. Then that evening, when no one was paying attention, the boy took a pencil and added 2 small stars in the upper corner of the picture, above the roof of the house. Beside the first star he wrote, Mom. Beside the second star he wrote, Wyatt. Sterling found the drawing late that night when he went downstairs for water. The refrigerator light cast a glow across the paper, and he stood there, glass in hand, looking at the 4 people and the 2 stars in crayon and pencil. The children weren't replacing anyone. They weren't erasing Joanna in order to draw Phoebe in. They were putting everyone in the same place, the living and the gone, on the same picture, beneath the same roof. Because in the world of children, loving someone new doesn't mean forgetting the person who came before, and losing someone doesn't mean they no longer belong to the family. Sterling stood in front of the refrigerator for a long time. Then he lifted a hand, straightened the star-shaped magnet so the picture hung a little more evenly, and walked away without saying a word. Everything broke on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks after the day Phoebe stepped into this house. She took Knox and Brinley to Grant Park after school, just as she had every Tuesday and Thursday since it had become a habit no one had formally assigned to her, but one she had quietly taken on. Brinley wanted the swings. Knox sat on a bench, drawing pigeons in his sketchbook, and Phoebe stood in the autumn sunlight watching the 2 children and, for the first time in 4 years, she felt something that resembled peace. She didn't know someone had taken a picture. An ordinary picture. A brown-haired woman pushing a curly-haired little girl on a swing in the park. But in the background was the Lincoln Park mansion as they had come through the gate, and the black car with license plates that anyone who knew Sterling Cross would recognize. The photo went up on social media Tuesday night. By Wednesday afternoon, Reed Gallagher was standing at the mansion gate. Security stopped him at the outer gate, exactly as procedure required, and called inside to report that a man claiming to be Phoebe's ex-husband was demanding to see her. Phoebe was in the kitchen preparing an afternoon snack for the children when Marsh came to tell her. Her face went pale at once, as though someone had drained all the blood from her body in a single second. "I'll go out," she said, her voice flat, calm in the way of someone far too calm. "No need to tell Sterling." Marsh looked at her, wanting to object, but Phoebe had already moved past him, out the door, walking down the stone path toward the gate. She didn't want Reed stepping into this house, didn't want his shadow touching anything in the mansion, didn't want him seeing the children's rooms, seeing the drawing on the refrigerator, seeing Wyatt's notebook on her bedside table, and more than anything, she didn't want to bring trouble into Sterling's life. She was living here on grace. She had no right to drag her own problems into someone else's world. Reed stood on the other side of the iron gate, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his posture easy, like a man waiting for a friend to join him for lunch instead of hunting for his ex-wife outside a Mafia boss's home. He looked good. He always looked good. That was the most dangerous thing about Reed Gallagher. He never looked like the kind of man who could hurt anyone, and that was why no one believed Phoebe when she told them. "Phoebe," he said with a smile, the kind of smile she had once thought was warm before she understood it was only a mask. "You look better. Being kept suits you." Phoebe stood on her side of the gate, far enough away that he couldn't touch her. "What do you want, Reed?" "I wanted to see how you were living. Heard you found yourself a nice place." He looked up toward the mansion and gave a soft whistle. "Very nice. Quite an upgrade from that old car in the library parking lot. I don't want to talk to you. I know. But you need to hear this." Reed stepped a little closer to the gate and lowered his voice, using that gentle, reasonable tone he had always used. The tone that had once made Phoebe believe she was wrong in every argument, that she was too sensitive, too weak, too dependent. "You're repeating yourself, Phoebe. Do you know that? Every single time. You can't live on your own, so you find the next man to cling to. Last time it was me. This time it's a mafia boss living in a mansion. Bigger scale. Same pattern. That's not what this is." "Really? Then why are you here? Because you're capable of taking care of yourself? Because you have a career, money, a plan?" He tilted his head, pretending sympathy. "Or because you're leaning on someone else's kindness again? Just like always. Because you don't know how to stand on your own 2 feet?" Every sentence struck exactly where he meant it to. Reed didn't need fists. He never had. His weapon was language. That calm, reasonable voice that made the person listening doubt herself. Wonder whether she really was as fragile as he said, whether she really was worth nothing, except clinging to other people. "How long do you think he'll keep you around?" Reed went on. "A month? 2 months? Until you stop being useful? You're just free childcare, Phoebe. You know that." Phoebe didn't answer. She turned her back and walked toward the house, and Reed didn't follow because he didn't need to. He had planted the seed. He knew it would grow in her mind, because it always grew, because he had spent 3 years teaching her to believe she was worthless. Phoebe stepped through the front door. Her face was white as paper. Her hand gripped the edge of the door as she closed it, gripping so tightly her knuckles blanched. She went straight upstairs, didn't speak to anyone, didn't eat dinner, didn't come down to the kitchen. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Phoebe's bedroom door stayed shut. No sound of her reading drifted down the hall. Brinley stood in the doorway of the children's room, her curls messy, stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm, looking at Sterling with a worried expression no 4-year-old should ever have to wear. "Is Miss Phoebe sick, Daddy? She didn't read to me." Sterling looked at his daughter, then up the hallway, toward Phoebe's closed door. He didn't yet know what had happened at the gate that afternoon. He didn't yet know who Reed Gallagher was, but he recognized, with the instinct of a man who had spent his whole life among people who knew how to wound others without leaving marks, that Phoebe was shrinking inward, folding into herself, shoulders curved, eyes searching for an exit, spine pulled tight, as though ready to run, exactly the way she had looked on the first day sitting on the steps outside Harold Washington Library, as if the past 6 weeks had never happened at all. Phoebe waited until 1 o'clock in the morning. She lay in bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening as the house slowly sank into silence. The sound of Sterling closing the study door at 11. The sound of Marsh checking the gate locks at 11:30. The dishwasher finishing its cycle and going still. The steady hum of the refrigerator. Then nothing left except darkness, and Reed's words circling in her head like a record stuck in the same groove. She's only free childcare. She doesn't know how to stand on her own feet. She's always dependent, always clinging, always a burden. Phoebe sat up, opened the closet, pulled out the bag she had brought into this house 6 weeks earlier, the canvas bag with the worn handles she had never dared tuck away in the back corner, because some part of her had always known this day would come. She packed, as little as the day she arrived, 2 sets of clothes, the same ones she had carried from the old car. Wyatt's leather-bound notebook, which she placed in first, at the bottom of the bag, the safest place. Knox's drawing, the portrait of Joanna with a face. She folded carefully and slipped between 2 pages of the notebook so it wouldn't wrinkle. Toothbrush, the washcloth Brinley had insisted she use because it has stars on it just like mine. Phoebe looked at the cloth, put it back on the bed. It wasn't hers. She wouldn't take it. She zipped the bag as softly as she could, but the sound of the zipper in the middle of the night seemed as loud as a blade cutting cloth. She slung the bag over her shoulder, opened her bedroom door, and stepped into the hallway. The lights were off. Only moonlight through the window at the far end of the hall cast a pale strip across the wooden floor. Phoebe moved toward the stairs, each step light, holding her breath. one hand on the banister. She would go out the back door, avoid the guards at the main gate, walk to the night bus stop on Clark Street, and disappear. Disappear the way she had disappeared from her marriage to Reed, from the apartment that had been taken, from the old life she used to have. She knew how to disappear. It was the only skill that 4 years of living on the margins had taught her well. She put her foot on the first stair. "Miss Phoebe." A small voice. Very small. But in the silence of the house at 1 a.m, it rang like a bell. Phoebe froze, turned around. Knox stood at the end of the hallway, his pajamas rumpled, his hair messy, his eyes wide in the dark. He looked at her, looked at the bag on her shoulder, looked at her hand on the stair rail, the posture of someone leaving instead of standing still, and he understood. 7 years old, but he understood, because he had seen that posture before. He didn't cry, didn't call for his father, didn't run to clutch her shirt. He only stood there at the end of the hallway and said, in a voice small but with every word clear, as if he had practiced the sentence in his head 1,000 times without ever saying it aloud. "My mom left at night too, then she didn't come back." 10 words. 10 words from the mouth of a 7-year-old child standing in the dark, watching the second most important person in his life carrying a bag in the middle of the night. And those 10 words nailed Phoebe in place more precisely than anything Reed had said that afternoon, because Reed had spoken to break her. But Knox spoke because he was afraid, and the fear of a 7-year-old child weighs more than every insult in the world. Phoebe looked at Knox, looked at Joanna's eyes in the darkness, the same eyes he had finally managed to draw 3 weeks ago, after so many nights beneath the glow of the nightlight, and she understood that if she walked down those stairs tonight, she would become the next faceless drawing in Knox's sketchbook. Another woman with hair, with shoulders, with the shape of a body, but fading, disappearing, until her face became the same blank space the boy could never fill in. Phoebe set the bag down on the floor, slowly. The sound of it touching wood was as soft as a sigh. She sat down on the top stair, her back against the railing, both hands resting in her lap. She didn't say anything. Knox looked at her, looked at the bag set down on the floor. Then the boy walked over and sat beside her on the stair, his shoulder touching hers, small and thin, but warm. They sat there in the dark, saying nothing, just sitting, just as Sterling had once sat with her in the kitchen. Silence enough, being beside each other enough. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, then the sound of very light footsteps at the end of the hallway. Brinley. How the little girl found her way out of bed no one knew. Curls stuck to her cheeks, eyes half closed, stuffed rabbit dragging along the floor. She always knew when someone in the house was awake. The strange instinct of a child growing up in a house too full of silence, where every unusual sound mattered. Brinley climbed into Phoebe's lap. Didn't ask why she was sitting on the stairs in the middle of the night. Didn't ask what the bag on the floor meant. She curled against Phoebe's chest, eyes closed, her sleepy voice tiny and soft. "Book lady, don't go. Tomorrow I want a story." Phoebe held Brinley. Her arm reached around Knox too, drawing the boy closer. The 3 of them sat on the stairs at nearly 3 a.m, inside a mansion far too large for 4 people, in a darkness filled only with breathing and heartbeats, and Phoebe decided to stay. Not because Reed was wrong. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was dependent. Maybe she didn't know how to stand alone. But these 2 children needed her, and she needed them. And sometimes that is the only reason anyone needs not to walk down the stairs in the middle of the night. Sterling found out at 7 o'clock that morning. Marsh set the iPad on his desk, played the security footage from the outer gate from the previous afternoon, and Sterling watched in silence. There was no sound in the video, only Phoebe standing on one side of the iron gate, her shoulders curling inward a little more with every passing second, and a man on the other side, posture easy, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted, mouth moving in a smooth, steady rhythm, as if he were having a friendly conversation with an old acquaintance. But Sterling didn't need sound to understand what was happening. He had spent his whole life among people who used words as weapons. He recognized at once the posture of the one attacking and the posture of the one taking the blows. Phoebe grew smaller as the video went on, shoulders bent, head lowered, arms folding around herself, and the man on the other side of the gate smiled from beginning to end. "Reed Gallagher," Marsh said. "Ex-husband, corporate attorney, office downtown, divorced 2 years ago. I ran his background." Sterling didn't ask when Marsh had run it. Marsh always ran background checks on everyone. That was one reason he was still alive after 10 years at Sterling's side. What else? It wasn't a question. Marsh placed a thin file on the desk. Tax fraud for 3 consecutive years. Inflated operating expenses. Concealed income through shell companies. Ethics violations. With 2 former clients who filed complaints with the Bar Association and later withdrew them for lack of evidence. Marsh paused. Now there's evidence. Sterling looked at the file. Then back at the screen, at Phoebe turning away and walking back toward the house with the shoulders of someone who had been knocked down without anyone seeing a wound. He didn't get angry. Didn't slam the desk. Didn't curse. Didn't pick up the phone to summon people. Those things were for men who lost control. And Sterling Cross never lost control. He stood, put on a black suit, adjusted his cufflinks, straightened his tie, picked up the file Marsh had placed on the desk. "I'm going alone," he said when Marsh moved to follow. Marsh stopped, looked at Sterling. The 2 men exchanged a glance for a single second, and Marsh nodded and stepped back, because he knew that when Sterling said alone in that tone, no one should follow. Sterling drove to Reed Gallagher's office on the 9th floor of a glass building on LaSalle Street, in the middle of the workday, in full daylight. He walked through the reception area, past the secretary saying, "Do you have an appointment?" Down the hallway with its thick carpet and warm lights, and opened Reed's office door without knocking. Reed was seated behind an oak desk, a phone pinned between his shoulder and ear, speaking to a client. He looked up when the door opened, and the polite smile on his face vanished the instant he saw who had entered. Sterling didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He closed the door behind him, walked to Reed's desk, and pulled out a chair and sat down as if it were his office and Reed were the guest. Reed ended the call. "Who are you?" he asked. "Sterling Cross." 2 words. Sterling saw his name land on Reed's face like a stone dropped into water. He recognized it. Of course he did. Anyone living in Chicago who read the news knew the name Sterling Cross, even if no one dared say it aloud in the wrong places. Reed straightened in his chair, lost the easy smile. Good. Sterling placed the file on the desk, neat and deliberate, between them. 3 years of tax fraud, he said, his voice as flat as if he were reading a menu. Inflated expenses. Shell companies. 2 ethics complaints from former clients, this time with documentation attached. Reed looked at the file. His face changed from calm to calculating to worried in 3 seconds. Sterling watched the transformation with the indifference of a man who had seen hundreds of loudmouthed men fold in on themselves when they were cornered. "You have 2 choices," Sterling said. "You leave her life completely. No contact, no searching, no appearing anywhere within the radius of her existence. Or, this file reaches the Internal Revenue Service and the Bar Association before the weekend ends. You have no right. I'm not finished." Sterling remained still, both hands resting on his thighs, gray eyes fixed on Reed with the look that men who owed him money knew very well. "Choose." Reed looked at the file, looked at Sterling, looked at the faint scar running along his neck, looked at the absolute calm on the face of the man sitting across from him, the calm of someone who didn't threaten because he didn't need to, because everything was already true, and truth had no need for a raised voice. Reed opened a drawer, took out a pen, signed the no-contact agreement Sterling had already prepared and tucked into the back of the file, because Sterling always knew the outcome before he entered the room. Reed signed with a hand that trembled slightly. Sterling took the agreement, stood, and buttoned his suit jacket. He walked to the door, and before closing it behind him, he added one more sentence, without turning back, his voice light, as if commenting on the weather. "She isn't dependent on anyone. She just hadn't found someone worthy of her trust." Then he closed the door, walked down the carpeted hallway, past the bewildered secretary, through the lobby, down the elevator, back into his car, and drove home without looking back once. Phoebe found out at lunch. Marsh was sitting at the kitchen counter eating a sandwich, while Phoebe set down plates of sliced fruit for the children. And he said to Knox in a normal voice, without thinking anything of it, "Your dad went to see that man at the gate this morning, so I guess no one will be bothering Miss Phoebe anymore." Then took another bite of his sandwich as if he had just commented on the weather. Knox didn't react. Brinley didn't hear because she was busy telling a story to her stuffed rabbit. But Phoebe went still at the counter, the knife stopping halfway through an apple, and she looked at Marsh with the kind of eyes he recognized at once as trouble. Sterling went to see Reed? She asked, her voice flat. Marsh stopped chewing, looked at Phoebe, looked down at the sandwich, then looked back at Phoebe and understood he had just made a mistake. Yeah, he said carefully. This morning, at his office. Who told him to go? No one. He decided on his own after watching the camera footage. Phoebe set down the knife, wiped her hands on a towel, walked out of the kitchen. She went straight upstairs, down the hallway, to the door of Sterling's study, and opened it without knocking. Sterling sat behind the desk, reading paperwork, a cup of black coffee by his right hand, a fountain pen by his left. He looked up when the door opened, and saw Phoebe standing in the doorway with eyes he had never seen on her before. Not fear, not sadness, not that shrinking inward she had worn on the library steps the first day. Anger. Phoebe stepped inside and shut the door behind her. The sound of it closing echoed through the large study, and Sterling set down his pen and sat straighter, because 10 years of instinct in the underworld had taught him that when someone closed a door before speaking, the conversation ahead would not be easy. You went to see Reed. It wasn't a question. Yes. Who gave you the right to do that? Sterling looked at her. He wasn't used to this tone from Phoebe. For 6 weeks she had been gentle, always grateful, always stepping back, always asking before she did anything in this house, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space. But the woman standing in front of him now wasn't stepping back. She stood straight, chin lifted, amber eyes burning with a fire he had never seen in her before, and he realized that she was at her most beautiful when she was angry, because when she was angry, she stopped trying to make herself small. You don't have the right to handle my life the way you handle your business, Phoebe said, every word sharp and clear. I'm not a shipment at the harbor. I'm not a number in a file. I'm not a problem to be solved. I'm a person, Sterling. And Reed is my problem, not yours. He came to my house. He came to see me, at the gate of your house, and I handled it by walking back inside and not speaking to him. You almost left in the middle of the night. That sentence stopped Phoebe for a beat. She didn't know Sterling knew about the stairs. Maybe Knox told him. Maybe the cameras. Maybe Marsh. In this house, there was nothing Sterling didn't know, and the thought made her feel safe and suffocated at the same time. Yes, she said. I almost left, because what Reed said made me believe I was a burden. But I stayed. I decided to stay. For Knox and Brinley. Not because you went and scared Reed for me. I didn't threaten him. I gave him the truth. You went to my ex-husband's office, put a file on his desk, and told him to disappear. How is that any different from the way Reed controlled me for 3 years? Different scale. Same nature. You made a decision for me without asking me a single question. That landed exactly where it needed to. Sterling didn't look away, didn't argue, didn't explain. He sat there, looking at Phoebe standing in front of his desk, telling him things no one had dared say to his face in 10 years. And the first thing he felt wasn't anger. It was respect. Because Phoebe was angry not because she was weak. She was angry because she believed she deserved to be asked, deserved to be treated like an adult with the right to decide her own life. And that belief, after 4 years of Reed grinding her down, after 4 years of living on the margins, after 4 years of blaming herself, was worth more than anything Sterling could buy with money or seize with power. I was wrong, Sterling said. 2 words. Quietly. No explanation. No defense. No but attached to them. Just 2 words. Heavy and real, falling between them. Phoebe stopped. She had been prepared for a longer fight, prepared for Sterling to argue back or retreat into cold silence the way he handled everything else. But I was wrong, was not what she had prepared for. Those 2 words sounded strange in this man's mouth. She knew that. Everyone in this house knew Sterling Cross didn't apologize, didn't admit fault, didn't bow his head to anyone. But he had just said those 2 words to her, and he meant them. I'm used to control, he said next, his voice lower, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. It's the only way I know to keep the people I care about safe. Control everything, anticipate everything, remove the threat before it reaches anyone. He paused. But it doesn't work. I controlled everything around Joanna, and I still couldn't keep her. Silence. Long. Heavy. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that comes after 2 people have just said something so true the air needs time to absorb it. Then Phoebe spoke. More gently now. Her anger lowered, but her clarity untouched. I don't need someone to rescue me, Sterling. I just need someone to stand beside me. Sterling looked at her, The woman standing before him, thin, exhausted, eyes still red after a sleepless night on the stairs, but with her back straight and her voice steady. Not the Phoebe from 6 weeks ago curled in on herself at the dining table searching for exits. Not the Phoebe from yesterday afternoon with the white face after seeing Reed. This was Phoebe taking back her right to be herself, and she was demanding it from Sterling Cross, the man no one demanded anything from. He nodded, slowly, one small nod, but it was the kind of nod Sterling had never given in 10 years of running his empire, because it wasn't the nod of command, wasn't the nod of strategic agreement, wasn't the nod of permission. It was a nod of acceptance. Acceptance that she was right. Acceptance that he was wrong. Acceptance that standing beside someone is different from standing in front of them to shield them, and that he needed to learn the difference. For the first time in his life, Sterling Cross nodded instead of giving an order, and Phoebe looked at him, saw that nod, and understood that it was worth more than any file he had ever placed on anyone's desk. 2 months. 2 months since the day Sterling said one night, and Phoebe still hadn't left. 2 months in which this house, far too large before, had begun to shrink down until it fit 4 people. 2 months in which Knox drew every day, Brinley laughed every day, Phoebe cooked and read and wiped the little girl's mouth, and sat beside Knox while he drew, and Sterling had started coming home earlier. He didn't say it. He didn't admit it. But Marsh noticed, because Marsh noticed everything, that the evening meetings had started running shorter, that Sterling checked his phone more often not for business, but because Brinley liked sending garbled voice messages about school, that sometimes in the middle of a meeting, Sterling would glance at the clock, and Marsh knew he was thinking about dinner. Then the envelope arrived, Monday morning, lying on Sterling's desk when he stepped into the study at 7 o'clock. A white envelope, no sender's name, no stamp, no postmark. Someone had placed it there during the night, which meant someone had gotten into the mansion without security knowing, and that fact alone was enough to make Sterling go still for 1 second before he opened the envelope with a hand that didn't shake. Inside was a photograph. Phoebe pushing Brinley on the swings at Grant Park, Knox sitting on the bench nearby, his sketchbook on his lap. Afternoon sunlight. The photograph had been taken clearly, closely, with a telephoto lens, which meant the person who took it had been standing no more than 20 yards away from them, and no one had noticed. On the back of the photograph, written in black ink, in block letters, "You have a new weakness." Sterling looked at the photograph, looked at Phoebe smiling, Brinley flying forward on the swing, Knox bent over his drawing. 3 people who had no idea they were being watched. 3 people he had allowed beyond the ring of protection because he had been foolish enough to think a public park in the afternoon was safe. He looked at the words, "A new weakness," and inside Sterling, something slammed shut, fast, decisive, like a steel door that had been standing cracked open for 2 months and was suddenly blown closed by the wind. 10 years of instinct in the underworld shoved everything else aside. Not thought, reflex. Cut off the weakness before the enemy can exploit it. Protect the core by removing the outer circle. Keep the children safe by cutting away the thing that makes them a target. And that thing was Phoebe. He called Marsh in. Ordered security increased. Every camera system checked. The source of the envelope traced. Then he said, in the voice Marsh had heard 100 times when Sterling made a decision no one was allowed to question, "Send Phoebe in here." Phoebe came to the study 5 minutes later. She stepped inside, saw Sterling standing behind the desk, not seated, his back straight, both hands clasped behind him, his face closed off. She understood immediately that the man standing in front of her was not the Sterling who had sat beside her on the back porch listening to Joanna's message. Not the Sterling who had nodded in this office the day before. This was Sterling Cross of the underworld. Stone. Steel. No emotion. "Sit down," he said. Not an invitation. Phoebe didn't sit. She stood, looked at him, waited. Sterling placed the photograph on the desk and turned it toward her. Phoebe looked down, saw herself, saw Brinley, saw Knox, saw the words on the back when Sterling turned it over for her. The blood drained from her face, but she didn't step back. "You need to leave," Sterling said. His voice was flat, cold, exact, just as it had been the day he stood on the library steps and asked her who she was. "I was wrong to let you stay this long. Your presence makes the children targets. You need to go." Phoebe looked at him, looked for a long time, and she saw, behind the steel mask, behind the cold voice and straight shoulders and unblinking gray eyes. She saw the thing Sterling was trying to hide with everything he had. Fear. He wasn't angry. He was afraid. Afraid the way he had been the night Joanna died. Afraid history would repeat itself, that someone would aim at the people he cared about, that he would stand there and watch one more person pay the price in his place. And the only way he knew to stop that was to push her out of the line of fire. "You're doing it again," Phoebe said, her voice not shaking, not angry like the day before, but sad, the kind of sadness heavier than anger, because it carried the disappointment of someone who had trusted and was now watching that trust begin to shake. "You're doing the same thing every man in my life has done, deciding for me and calling it protection." Sterling didn't answer. His face didn't change. Not one muscle moved, closed off, completely, like the iron door had slammed shut. "Yesterday you said you were wrong to control my life," Phoebe said. "Today you're sending me away without asking what I want. So what did I was wrong mean yesterday, Sterling?" He still didn't answer. Because if he opened his mouth, if he said anything at all, his voice would shake, and Sterling Cross didn't shake, never had, because shaking was weakness, and weakness got you killed in the world he came from. Phoebe waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. He didn't speak. She nodded slowly, understanding that the door had closed and she didn't have the key, at least not today. Phoebe didn't pack right away. She remained standing in Sterling's study for 10 more seconds after she understood that he wasn't going to say anything. 10 seconds of looking at the man standing behind the desk with his face closed off and waiting for him to say stay, waiting for him to say we'll find another way, waiting for him to do anything other than stand there like the wall Joanna had once said he resembled. He said nothing. Phoebe turned, walked out, and closed the door softly, because she wasn't the kind of person who slammed doors even when she wanted to, because even in pain, she was careful with other people's doors. Her room on the 2nd floor. She opened the closet, pulled out the canvas bag with the worn handles, the same bag she had pulled out 2 months earlier in the middle of the night before Knox stopped her on the stairs. This time, no one stopped her. She packed Wyatt's leather-bound notebook first, at the bottom, the safest place. The 2 sets of clothes she had brought the first day, now washed clean and neatly folded. Knox's drawing, the portrait of Joanna with a face. She folded carefully and slipped between the pages of the notebook. Toothbrush. Nothing else. 2 months in this house, and everything that belonged to her still fit into a single bag. She looked around the room. The bed was neatly made, blankets smooth, pillows straight, not a trace left to show she had ever slept there, except Brinley's washcloth with little stars on it sitting on the bedside table. She left it there. It wasn't hers. Phoebe went downstairs to the kitchen. The children were there. Knox sat at the table with his sketchbook open, but wasn't drawing. Brinley sat in the high chair, legs swinging, coloring a new picture. Both of them looked up when Phoebe walked in, and both of them saw the bag on her shoulder. Brinley looked at the bag, looked at Phoebe. The crayon in her hand stopped midway across the page. Knox looked at the bag, then looked down at the sketchbook, and his hand tightened around the edge of the table. "I need to go away for a few days," Phoebe said. Her voice was calm, perfectly calm, but her eyes weren't. Her eyes were red and bright, and Phoebe tried not to blink because she knew that if she blinked, the tears would fall, and she couldn't cry in front of the children, not this time. "I'll call, I promise." Knox didn't cry. Knox never cried. He looked at Phoebe with Joanna's eyes, with the same look Phoebe had seen on the stairs in the middle of the night, the look of someone who knows something bad is happening, but has become too used to bad things to react anymore. He didn't speak, didn't ask why, didn't beg her to stay. He only stood, picked up the sketchbook, and walked out of the kitchen. Phoebe watched him go up the stairs, his steps light, his back straight, so much like Sterling that she wanted to scream. 7 years old and already knowing how to shut the door on his feelings when he hurt. 7 years old and already knowing that clinging to someone who is leaving only makes it hurt more when they go. 7 years old and already having lost too many people to believe that a few days truly means a few days. Knox didn't go to his room. He went to Sterling's study, opened the door without knocking, exactly the way Phoebe had done the day before, set the sketchbook on his father's desk, and opened it to the last page, the newest drawing. 4 people sitting on the front steps of the house. Sterling the tallest, sitting on the upper step. Phoebe beside him, brown hair tied low. Knox and Brinley on the lower step, sitting close together. In the sky were 2 stars, just like the picture Brinley had taped to the refrigerator. But this one Knox had drawn, the pencil lines finer, more detailed, and every person's face was there. Clear, because Knox had learned how to remember. Beneath the drawing, in the crooked block letters of a 7-year-old child, "My family." Knox set the sketchbook down, turned, walked out, went to his room, closed the door. Not a single sound came from behind it. Downstairs, Brinley had understood. The crayon dropped onto the table. She jumped down from the high chair and ran after Phoebe to the front door, her shoes with blinking lights tapping against the wooden floor. "Book lady." She grabbed the hem of Phoebe's shirt with both hands and pulled, holding on with the full strength of a 4-year-old who believed that if she held tightly enough, people wouldn't leave. "Book lady, you promised you wouldn't go. Book lady, you promised." Phoebe dropped to her knees right there at the door, set the bag aside, pulled Brinley into her arms and held her tightly, burying her face in the little girl's curls, breathing in the smell of children's shampoo and crayons and candy that Brinley always seemed to keep hidden in her pockets. "I remember," Phoebe said into Brinley's hair, softly, only loud enough for the child to hear. "I remember the promise." She let Brinley go, stood up, picked up the bag, opened the door, walked outside. She didn't look back because if she looked back she would see Brinley standing in the doorway with those wide brown eyes full of tears, and then she wouldn't be able to leave. The old car started. Phoebe drove out through the gate, the guards opening the iron doors, and the little car disappeared into the Chicago streets in the middle of the afternoon. On the second floor, Sterling stood at the window of his study. He watched the old car grow smaller and then vanish at the end of the street. On the desk behind him, the sketchbook Knox had left remained open to the last page. "My family." He didn't turn around to look at it. The house fell silent again, the old kind of silence. The silence Sterling had lived with for 2 years before Phoebe arrived. But now it was different. Before, silence had felt normal, because he hadn't known what Brinley's laughter echoing in the kitchen every morning sounded like, hadn't known what Knox's pencil scratching across paper every evening sounded like, hadn't known what Phoebe's voice reading stories down the hallway at 9 o'clock sounded like. Now he knew. And silence was no longer normal. It was 100 times heavier. The first night, Knox didn't come out for dinner. Sterling called through the closed door twice. His voice normal the first time, lower the second. No one answered. He stood outside his son's room and realized that this closed door was exactly like the door he shut in his study whenever he didn't want to face something. And Knox had learned this from him, learned how to close himself off when he hurt, learned how to stay silent instead of speak, learned how to turn into a wall because his father was a wall. Sterling set a plate of rice outside Knox's door, set it down on the floor gently, the way Phoebe had once laid a cloth across Brinley's forehead the night she had a fever. Then he walked away. The next morning the plate was untouched. Cold rice, wilted vegetables. The small pieces of chicken Sterling had cut to exactly the size Knox liked, because he remembered. He remembered everything about his son, but remembering didn't help when the child wouldn't open the door. Sterling picked up the plate, carried it into the kitchen, threw it away. Then he sat down at the table, alone, in the kitchen that only a week ago had been filled with Brinley telling stories about the goldfish, Phoebe asking Knox what he had drawn that day, the sound of forks against plates, laughter, life. Now there was only the steady hum of the refrigerator and the smell of bitter coffee. Sterling went into his study, sat behind the desk. Knox's sketchbook was still open to the last page, the drawing of 4 people on the steps, "My family" written beneath it, and Sterling hadn't turned the page, hadn't closed it, hadn't moved it away, because moving it away would feel like admitting that drawing had become the past. He opened the drawer, took out Joanna's phone, turned it on, listened to the message again. "Let someone in, Sterling. I believe in you." Joanna's voice filled the empty room. He listened twice, 3 times, then turned it off, set the phone down, and stared at Knox's drawing on the desk until his vision blurred, not from tears, from exhaustion, because he wasn't sleeping and wasn't eating and didn't know what he was doing anymore. The second night, 2 o'clock in the morning, Sterling lay in bed beneath the towering ceiling in the dark, and his bedroom door opened. Light footsteps on the floor, a small breath. Then Brinley climbed onto the bed in the way only a 4-year-old climbs, both hands gripping the edge of the mattress, one knee first, the rest of her body dragging after, stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. She rolled against Sterling's side, found his arm, and wrapped both of her tiny hands around it. Lay still for a moment. Sterling thought she had fallen asleep, but then Brinley spoke, her voice sleepy, but every word so clear it drove straight into Sterling's chest like nails. "Daddy, did you make Book Lady go away?" Sterling opened his eyes in the dark, looked up at the ceiling, felt his 4-year-old daughter holding his arm tightly, her little body warm, full of absolute trust, and she was asking him a question for which no answer existed that wouldn't be a lie. "Go to sleep, Brinley," he said. Low, rough. "Is Book Lady coming back? Go to sleep." Brinley fell silent. Then she wrapped herself more tightly around Sterling's arm, pressed her face against his shoulder, and slept. Sterling didn't sleep. He lay there staring at the ceiling. His daughter's 4-year-old arms looped around him, and thought about where Phoebe might be tonight, in the old car or on a park bench or on the back steps of the library, and he had pushed her there, pushed her back to the place where he had found her, and the name for that action wasn't protection. The name for it was cowardice. The third night. Knox still kept the door shut. The second plate of rice Sterling placed outside his room also went untouched. Brinley didn't ask about Book Lady anymore. She was quieter, laughed less, carried the stuffed rabbit all day. The house was shrinking back into what it had once been, a cold box holding 3 people who didn't know how to talk to one another. Sterling went down to the kitchen at midnight, turned on the light, and saw Brinley's drawing on the kitchen floor, right beneath the refrigerator. It had fallen. The star-shaped magnet still clung to the refrigerator, but the paper had slipped loose and dropped face down onto the floor. Sterling picked it up, turned it over. 4 crayon figures in front of the square house. The 2 pencil stars Knox had added in the upper corner. "Mom. Wyatt." He stood in the middle of the kitchen, the drawing in his hand, and looked at it for a very long time. 4 people. 2 stars. Not 3 people and a guest. Not 3 people and a babysitter. 4 people. Family. The children had never once called Phoebe a guest. From the beginning they had known what she was. Only Sterling had needed 2 months to understand, and then 3 days to destroy it. He taped the drawing back onto the refrigerator, pressed the star magnet more firmly into place, stood there looking at it. And in the empty kitchen at midnight, Sterling heard Joanna's voice again in his head, without even needing to turn on the phone, because he had heard it enough times to know it by heart. "Let someone in." But this time he heard the part that fear had hidden from him for 2 years. Joanna hadn't said, "Let someone in if it's safe." She hadn't said, "Let someone in when the danger is gone." She hadn't said, "Let someone in when you're sure you won't lose them." She had only said, "Let someone in," because Joanna knew the thing Sterling needed 3 sleepless nights to understand. Love was never safe. It had never come with guarantees. It came with no contract, no 24-hour protection, no iron gates or security cameras. It was simply worth it. Worth the risk. Worth being afraid and stepping forward anyway. Worth opening the door even when opening it meant you might lose someone all over again. Sterling looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. 4 people. 2 stars. Then he took his car keys and walked out of the house. Sterling drove through Chicago at 1 o'clock in the morning. He didn't call Marsh. He didn't bring bodyguards. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a white dress shirt wrinkled from having been on his body since the morning before. Sleeves rolled to his elbows, collar open, the faint scar running down the left side of his neck fully visible. He didn't look like the Sterling Cross the Chicago underworld knew. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 nights, driving through the city to find something he had pushed away with his own hands. He knew where she was. He didn't need Marsh to trace her, didn't need cameras, didn't need anything at all, because he knew Phoebe, knew after 2 months of watching her every day, knew that she would return to the place where she had felt safest, and that place wasn't her old apartment or a bus stop or any roof over her head. That place was the back steps of Harold Washington Library, where she had once sat reading books to children who weren't hers, where Knox had found her, where everything had begun. Sterling parked in the library lot, turned off the engine, sat in the car for a minute with both hands on the steering wheel, looking through the windshield toward the back of the building, and saw her. Phoebe was sitting on the steps, in the exact same place as before, under the weak spill of a streetlight. Wyatt's leather-bound notebook rested on her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was only sitting there, both hands on either side of the notebook, her back against the iron railing, her head tilted up toward the Chicago night sky with no stars visible because the city was too bright. Her old car was parked nearby, the back seat folded flat, with a pillow and a thin blanket inside. She had been sleeping in the car for 3 nights, Back where it started. Sterling got out of the car, closed the door. The sound echoed through the empty lot. And Phoebe turned. She watched him walking toward her, saw the wrinkled shirt, the dark circles under his eyes, the exhaustion in the way he moved, and she didn't stand. She didn't run. She didn't fold into herself. She simply sat there, looking at him, waiting, because she had run out of strength to run and run out of strength to be afraid. Sterling reached the bottom of the steps, stopped, looked up at Phoebe. Then he climbed them slowly and sat down beside her, on the same step, in the same place Knox had first sat on the day he brought a bag of food to the strange woman reading books behind the library. Sterling sat there, silent, looking straight ahead at the empty parking lot and the bare trees lining the street. Phoebe said nothing. She looked straight ahead, too, the two of them sitting side by side on the cold steps, waiting. Because they both knew the one who had to speak first was Sterling. And he needed time, because Sterling Cross wasn't used to saying the things that mattered, and every word that would come from his mouth tonight would weigh more than any order he had ever given in 10 years of power. I was wrong. Those 2 words again. But this time, they were different. The last time he said them in his study, behind a desk, inside a room he controlled. This time he said them on the cold library steps in a parking lot at 1 o'clock in the morning, with no suit, no power, nothing at all except a tired man sitting beside the woman he had pushed away. I pushed you away because I was afraid. Afraid exactly the way I was the night Joanna died. Afraid that keeping you close meant putting you in the line of fire, and I couldn't survive it if one more person paid the price for me. He stopped, breathed, continued, because if he stopped too long, he wouldn't finish. Knox hasn't spoken in 3 days. The plates of food I leave outside his door come back untouched. Brinley climbed into my bed in the middle of the night and asked if Daddy had made Booklady go away. His voice dropped lower. And I listened to Joanna's message every night you were gone, not because I missed Joanna, because that was when I missed you most and didn't know what to do with missing you. Phoebe kept looking ahead. Tears were running down her face, but she didn't wipe them away, because both her hands were gripping Wyatt's notebook, and she didn't want to let go. I don't need you to be perfect, Sterling, she said, softly but steadily, in the voice of someone who had cried enough for 3 nights and now had nothing left to hide. I just need you to stop running. Sterling slipped a hand into his pocket, took out something small that fit in the center of his palm, a silver bracelet. Phoebe recognized it at once, because she had seen it on Brinley's wrist every day. The bracelet the little girl never took off. Joanna's bracelet. Brinley gave it to me this morning, Sterling said. She took it off herself, put it on my desk, and said, Daddy, bring this to Booklady and tell her to come back. He opened his hand. The thin silver bracelet lay in his broad palm, catching a faint glint beneath the streetlight. And Phoebe saw that on the inside of the bracelet there was a new engraving, beside the name Joanna that had already been there. Another name. Wyatt. 5 letters. Engraved in the same style, the same size, right beside Joanna, as if those 2 names had always belonged in the same place. I had it engraved this morning, Sterling said. The children should remember everyone who loved them, even the ones they never had the chance to meet. Phoebe looked at the bracelet, looked at her brother's name beside his wife's name on the silver surface, and the tears fell, falling into Sterling's open palm, holding the bracelet, falling onto the cool metal, falling onto the 2 names of 2 people who were gone, and yet had never truly left the 2 people sitting on these steps. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say I forgive you. She didn't say I love you. She only reached out, took the bracelet from his hand, and nodded. One small nod. But it held everything that needed to be said. They arrived back at the Lincoln Park mansion at dawn. The Chicago sky shifted from black to violet to pale pink along the horizon, and the first light of the new day fell across the roof, across the black iron fence, across the stone path leading from the gate to the front door. Sterling parked in front of the house. Phoebe sat in the passenger seat, Wyatt's notebook on her lap, the silver bracelet resting in her palm, warm because she had held it the entire way home. She looked at the house through the car window, looked at the front door, and saw Knox. The boy was standing in the doorway, in his pajamas, barefoot, hair tousled. No one had told him to wake up. No one had called for him. There had been no sound from the car loud enough to wake a child sleeping on the 2nd floor at dawn. But Knox knew, just as he had known the night Phoebe carried her bag to the stairs. Just as he had known which days to bring an extra apple in the paper bag to the library, by that instinct, only children who have lost too much ever seem to have. The instinct to keep watch, the instinct to wait, the instinct to know when someone is about to leave and when someone is about to return. Phoebe opened the car door, stepped out, stood on the stone path with the old canvas bag over her shoulder, dawn light falling across her face. Knox looked at her from the doorway. Then the boy ran, bare feet over the cold stone, running across the path, running without stopping, and crashing straight into Phoebe, both arms wrapped around her waist, his face pressed into her shirt, holding on so tightly that she had to step back once to keep her balance. For the first time in 2 years, Knox was hugging someone who wasn't his father. He didn't say a word. He only held on, and Phoebe held him back, one arm around his shoulders, the other still clutching the silver bracelet, and she felt Knox's shoulders tremble even though he wasn't crying. He never cried, but his body shook with relief, because the person he had waited for had come back, because this time was different from the last time. This time the person who left in the night had returned at dawn. "Book, lady!" The cry came from the doorway. Brinley. She appeared behind Knox like a little curly-haired explosion, barefoot too, stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, racing down the path at the full speed of a 4-year-old who had just woken up. "Book lady is back! Book lady is back!" Brinley threw her arms around Phoebe's leg from the other side of Knox, and the three of them stood there on the path in front of the Lincoln Park mansion in the dawn light, holding on to one another, Phoebe in the middle, Knox on one side, Brinley on the other, and they looked like the thing Sterling had not dared name for 2 months but now could call by no other word. Family. Sterling stood leaning against the front door frame, hands in his pockets, shirt wrinkled, eyes shadowed from exhaustion, and he smiled. Only a little, almost impossible to see, but real. The first smile that had reached his eyes in 2 years. 6 months later, spring. Chicago grew warmer day by day, and the backyard of the Lincoln Park mansion was no longer empty. There was a new wooden table beneath the maple tree, now covered in fresh leaves, a long bench big enough for 10 children, a small bookshelf Phoebe had built with Knox from reclaimed wood, and every Saturday afternoon, Phoebe read stories there to the neighborhood children. She didn't read on the back steps of the library anymore. She read at home, in her own home. Knox sat in the corner of the yard, a new sketchbook on his lap, his pencil moving in steady strokes. He was 8 years old now, taller, less silent, still sparing with words, but when he spoke every word carried weight, just like his father. The newest picture he was drawing showed 4 people sitting on the front steps of the house, more detailed than the old one, the pencil lines more confident, and every face was clear now. Every face had eyes and a nose and a mouth, because Knox didn't forget anymore. Knox had learned how to remember. In the sky, 2 stars. Brinley ran through the yard, curls flying, new shoes with blinking lights, and around her wrist was her mother's silver bracelet. The bracelet now held 3 names engraved inside it. Joanna, Wyatt, Brinley, because Brinley had demanded her own name be added too, saying, "I want to be next to Mommy and Wyatt too," and no one had any reason to refuse her. Sterling stood leaning against the glass door looking out at the yard, black coffee in his hand, and he looked at Phoebe. On the ring finger of her left hand was a simple silver ring, no diamond, no pattern, only a plain band, and inside it, one single word had been engraved, chosen, because that was what they had done. It wasn't fate that pushed them together. It wasn't magic or coincidence. It was choice. Every day, every morning, every night, they chose one another, chose to stay, chose to open doors instead of closing them, chose trust instead of fear. Knox looked up from his sketchbook toward the sky. 2 butterflies drifted across the yard, their delicate wings shimmering in the spring sunlight, passing over the wooden table, over the little bookshelf, over Brinley's head as she ran. "Dad," Knox said, his voice soft but clear enough for both Phoebe and Sterling to hear. "I think that's Mom and Wyatt." Brinley stopped running, tilted her face up, looked at the 2 butterflies and waved. "Mommy, Wyatt, look at us." Sterling looked at Phoebe. Phoebe looked back at him, and in the spring sunlight, amid Brinley's laughter and the soft scratch of Knox's pencil over paper, and the sound of the neighborhood children stumbling through their reading at the wooden table beneath the maple tree, the 2 of them looked at each other with the kind of gaze that needed no words beside it. "Maybe," Sterling said, "and if it really is them, then they can see that we're all right." The story ends here, but healing never truly ends. It goes on every day. In every breakfast, Phoebe cooks for the children. In every drawing, Knox finishes. In every story, Brinley tells to her stuffed rabbit. In every evening, Sterling comes home a little earlier than he did the day before. Not perfect, never perfect, but real, and real is enough. Thank you all for listening all the way to the final lines of this story. If you felt your heart touched, if there was any moment that made you want to hold the people you love a little tighter, then please press the like button so we know this story reached exactly where it needed to go. Share this video with the people you think need to be reminded that they deserve to be loved, deserve to heal, deserve to be chosen by someone every single day. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe and turn on the bell so you can stay with us every day for new stories. We would truly love to hear what you felt deep in your heart, who this story made you think of, which moment touched you the most, so please write it in the comments below. We read every line and treasure every word you share. I wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and always to be surrounded by people who love you. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.